This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Online harassment takes many forms, and victims often have limited ways to protect themselves. Today, we explore this form of harassment. Nina Jankowicz knows what it's like. She was targeted by political disinformation campaigns and on social media. She's the author of How to Be a Woman Online, Surviving Abuse and Harassment, and How to Fight Back. She described the social media attacks on her to WHYY's Fresh Air earlier this year, saying, "It's not just mean words on the internet. It was real, violent threats to her and her family, as well as attacks on her very being." Jankowicz joins us. Coming up, we learn how an online forum called Kiwi Farms served as a platform for users to dox and torment transgender and neurodivergent people. And later we ask whether the Alex Jones verdict could influence how people behave. Have you experienced online harassment? We want to hear from you too. You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Today we'll be talking about adult themes, and this episode is not appropriate for young listeners and for listeners who may find the topic disturbing. With us on Zoom now is Nina Jankowicz, Vice President at the Center for Information Resilience, a UK-based nonprofit that focuses on countering misinformation, documenting human rights abuse, and combating online harms. Nina, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
I guess first off, how did you get interested in disinformation and also researching online harassment?
Yeah, so the lens that I look at all of this stuff through is the lens of Russia, actually. I did my degree in Russian studies, did a graduate degree in kind of the region as well, and spent my early first few years of my career working for an organization that did democracy support for organizations in Central and Eastern Europe and around the world. And I saw a lot of the partners that we were working with in places like Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine being targeted with what back then we called, just Russian propaganda, because it was domestically oriented. We weren't quite in the era of, global disinformation campaigns yet, but it was really a precursor to what we saw in the 2016 election. And then I spent the years of 2016 and 2017 in Ukraine advising the foreign ministry there on strategic communications. So this was already after the war in Ukraine that has escalated now, began in 2014. And of course, during the US election. And that's when I really started to think about how, the West approaches disinformation with a lot of hubris. We think we're the first people that this has ever happened to, but it's our allies in Central and Eastern Europe that have been dealing with this for decades. And that's when I really got interested in this field and how we could kind of deal with this, existential threat to democracy. And during that research that I was doing out in Ukraine, I came across stories of women who had been targeted by the Kremlin. They were opposition figures, journalists, and in general, women with opinions really out there in their countries. And they had been targeted with this, sexualized and gendered disinformation that tried to paint them as people who were untrustworthy, people who were, not part of the patriarchal society that their countries, were grounded on. And that's when I really started to research online hate and gender disinformation. We often talk about racial cleavages or economic cleavages when we talk about disinformation, but very, very few people were even mentioning gender as a cleavage, even though, of course, Hillary Clinton was targeted with a lot of similar attacks during her campaign. And so since then, I've been researching not only how Russia uses this tactic, but how Iran and China use it, and how, frankly, domestic actors in our own political discourse use it against women to silence us.
Right. And then I understand you got a dream job working, I believe, with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to counter disinformation. You then became a target. Can you tell our listeners more?
Yeah, it's a long story, but let me tell you the short version. I, as you said, had spent a lot of time working in this field and really had always focused on solutions, had focused on what our governments can do to counter disinformation. And to be clear, that doesn't mean censoring people. That doesn't mean removing things from the internet. In fact, I write very frequently about how playing what I call whack-a-troll and just removing offensive accounts or speech that is incorrect is not going to solve the problem. I'm much more interested in in, really whole of society solutions that solve the root causes of disinformation. And so I was appointed to lead the Disinformation Governance Board at DHS. Unfortunately, a fairly draconian sounding name, but its purpose was just to coordinate across the Department of Homeland Security, which is a huge, huge department with many disparate missions under its umbrella, to coordinate the activities that many of the agencies were doing with regard to information integrity. So looking at how FEMA was helping connect people with good information around natural disasters, looking at how Customs and Border Protection was trying to dispel disinformation around irregular migration to the United States from the southern border. And of course, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, deals with disinformation around elections. And that's just a few of the things that we were looking at. And it was just a coordinating body. And unfortunately, because the department coordinated and communicated rather in a fairly opaque way about the mission, that informational vacuum was filled in by political partisans who called the department and the board a ministry of truth, said that I was going to be America's chief censor or a truth czar, which was the farthest thing from the truth possible. And in that vacuum of information, they also started digging around in my personal life, targeting me and my family. I was 8.5 months pregnant at the time the board was announced, and they started talking about, my pregnancy and marital status. We were doxxed. We received letters to our home and phone calls to our personal numbers, and I was receiving violent threats on a regular basis. And in fact, I still receive at least a few of them a week. And in fact, there's often influxes when I'm mentioned on, Fox News or another right-wing channel, or when senators and members of Congress are mentioning me on the House floor, which happens fairly frequently. So it's really shocking the degree to which my life was changed simply for wanting to serve my country in my area of expertise. And as a result of both the department's kind of inability to counter those lies and stick up for me, the woman that they brought in to lead this effort, as well as the harassment against my family, I decided to leave the department just over 5 months ago.
That's a lot, and I'm sorry that happened to you, Nina. When we think about how this kind of spiraled, maybe explain to our listeners in terms of how influencers or how people would post this disinformation about the role and the gendered abuse that you experienced, and how it became more than just a trickle. And I'm wondering if you can talk more about that.
Yeah, it happened fairly quickly. So the announcement went out one morning, and by 1 or 2 p.m. that afternoon, a prominent conservative influencer with over 1 million Twitter followers had posted that the board was a ministry of truth. And again, I was a disinformation czar, which was false. And immediately from there, the kind of abuse and threats escalated fairly quickly. By that evening, my husband and I were looking at how to install a security camera in the front of our house, because I've studied this and I knew where it was going. The next day, I was on Fox News almost all day, not me personally, but images of me, discussion of me, videos I had posted on the internet. And that's when the threats started to get really quite disturbing. Mm-hmm. And then from there, again, members of Congress engaged in this behavior as well, just, sharing falsehoods on the floor of Congress, calling press conferences, which led to, it's not just, Twitter DMs or tweets. It was emails to me on my personal email address. It was, again, mail to my home and to the department. It was LinkedIn messages, people doing this under their real names and saying things like, this is our 1776 moment, or you've committed treason and you deserve to be punished, and things that I can't really repeat on air, along with sexualized threats as well. My face appeared on a manual that somebody put together for improvised munitions, right? So like real threats to me and my family. And the thing that still, 5 months later, that really bothers me is that the influencers and the members of Congress and all of the pundits who engaged in this just gross speculation, and that's like the most diplomatic thing that you could say about it. I think it was quite deliberate obfuscation of the truth. They knew what they were saying was false. They also knew that the people that follow them on the internet are apt to engage in this behavior. This is not something that is an outlier. This happens a lot. It is, shown in what happened with folks who are doxxed and targeted, like the gamer Keffels recently, who was doxxed. It happened to the Alex Jones, targets of abuse, the families from Sandy Hook. This is not new. And I think we need to have some accountability and responsibility. These people are profiting off of it. They are selling ads. They are profiting in power as well. And what they're doing is just trying to evoke fear in people to continue engagement in their shows, in their platforms, and they're ruining lives in the process. Now, I'm going to keep speaking out about this, and I'm going to not let folks get away with it. And I'm very focused on changing the way that the internet works for those who come after me. But I really do think that people need to recognize there's not a nice little neat split between the online and the offline anymore, particularly in the age of COVID, where so much of our work and social lives has moved online. If you are trying to drive people off the internet, not only from expressing themselves in a democratic way, but just in connecting with other humans in general, you're really affecting their day-to-day lives. And it shouldn't be something that we view as part of the political discourse in America. It should be unacceptable to everybody.
And Nina, you're exactly right. The consequences of the people who have been targeted versus those who perpetuate these lies, these abuses online, because that's the goal, right? To silence people. You resigned again from this job that you were really looking forward to, but you have chosen not to stay silent. But that's hard for some people to even attempt because of how insidious this is.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book, which I wrote prior to joining the department, because I had experienced this type of abuse before, of course, not to the degree that I experienced it this year. And I had seen how other women were affected by it. And I wanted to make sure that, people in the unfortunate position of being targets of online abuse had a toolkit available to them to understand kind of, okay, here's where I find myself. How can I best protect myself? Or how can I protect myself proactively in the event that this does happen? Because it's not just, people with tens of thousands of Twitter followers that this happens to. You can just be a normal person online expressing your opinion, and unfortunately you can get hit with some of this stuff. So it's things like locking down your IT security, making sure that you have a support network, understanding the infrastructure of the platform so that you can send in reports and make sure there is at least some modicum of accountability for the people who are abusing you. It's not enough. It puts the onus on the target of the abuse to take care of this stuff when there are multi-billion-dollar corporations profiting off of it, as well as the individual influencers who are making money off of these things as well. But at least I hope it helps women and other marginalized communities hold their ground, because our democracy can't function if 50% of the population is too afraid to make their voice heard. And I know that, for the young women who I mentor, my students, et cetera, this stuff matters, to see women continuing to speak out in the face of this ridiculous and unfortunately very normal abuse.
You're hearing Nina Jankowicz here where we live, Vice President at the Center for Information Resilience, as we talk about online harassment. Her organization is a UK-based nonprofit that focuses on countering misinformation, documenting human rights abuse, and combating online harms. And she's also the author of How to Be a Woman Online, Surviving Abuse and Harassment, and How to Fight Back. We're going to be talking more after the break about some other examples of online harassment and the consequences for perpetrators of this. You can join us, too, if you have a question or comment, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. This episode contains adult themes not appropriate for young listeners and for listeners who may find the topic disturbing. Now, our connection to the online world brings us many advantages. There are also plenty of drawbacks, like online harassment, which is the most insidious. We've been talking about it with my guest, Nina Jankowicz, who experienced this firsthand and has written a book called How to Be a Woman Online, Surviving Abuse and Harassment, and How to Fight Back. Transgender people have also been frequent targets of online harassment. A website known as Kiwi Farms, known for harassment campaigns against transgender and neurodivergent people, had been booted off the internet after trans activists launched a campaign to get this fringe forum deplatformed. Joining us now with more is Kat Tenbarge, who's reported on Kiwi Farms. Kat is a tech and culture reporter at NBC News. Kat, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Kat, this might be the first time many of our listeners have even heard of Kiwi Farm. So describe this online forum.
Sure. So Kiwi Farms first originated in about 2013. And it's a forum online, which means that people can anonymously create accounts in order to post information on various message boards and threads. And so as somebody who has seen this website as part of my reporting, I can describe what some of those pages looked like. And for example, Kiwi Farms would find an individual to begin compiling information about. So this could be a trans influencer, or this could be a prominent neurodivergent individual online, but it could also be a very private individual, someone who a lot of people would not know about. And what their threads typically looked like was, at first, individuals who were members of the forum would begin to just compile all different kinds of information. This could range from publicly known social media accounts, things like Twitter handles, Twitch profiles, but individuals on Kiwi Farms would take this further and would actually attempt to collect private information, things like people's addresses, phone numbers, criminal records, housing records, employment records, and then even beyond that, they would find information about friends and family members, combing through Facebook pages and other social media profiles to create a file, essentially, on this person. And so these sort of files would live on Kiwi Farms for years at a time, and they would serve as a place where people could come with the intent to harass or defame or maliciously discuss these individuals. And as we've seen in many different cases with these individuals, that harassment would jump from just Kiwi Farms into having real life consequences.
So everything you've described, this releasing of personal information, posting it online, that's what doxing is.
Yes.
When we think about the consequences, as we were talking with Nina earlier, I mean, this harassment is so severe, it has led some people who've been targeted to die by suicide.
Yes.
What can you tell us about that?
So in the cases of some of these individuals, and I think this is a really important facet of Kiwi Farms that oftentimes people maybe underestimate or don't realize, is that yes, they do target high-profile individuals, but I think in these cases where individuals unfortunately died by suicide, a lot of times they weren't particularly well known. And so what you have happening here is an individual who may already be relatively isolated from their community. I think Kiwi Farms members maliciously targeted individuals who may have had past histories of mental illness, or who may maybe openly struggled with things like suicidal ideation or a desire to die by suicide. And so they find these very vulnerable people and can stage literally years-long campaigns that can include defamatory information, making up things that these individuals were supposedly having done that weren't true, saying things like, in the example of transgender people, they would make up really malicious fables of them being predatory toward young people or toward people in their own communities. And people were ultimately, I think, just feeling like they couldn't escape from the harassment and the online history of Kiwi Farms that had followed them. And so in the case of some of these individuals who died by suicide, they left behind notes, or they maybe left behind statements about some of the motivations that they had. And Kiwi Farms was actually mentioned as one of the driving factors that led these individuals to make that choice.
Mm. Again, this was an online fringe forum that existed since 2013. So it wasn't until a woman by the name of Clara Sorrenti, better known online as Keffels, a trans activist, a target of Kiwi Farms. This is her describing how she was targeted, and this audio is from CNN.
And I thought that if I got far away and went to a different continent, they wouldn't be able to do the same thing. And then it turned out I was wrong. They were able to cross-reference what they saw on the bed sheets with every other hotel in the city until they found out that the specific bed sheets only had a pattern in this one hotel that I was staying at. People have been trying to get this site offline for nearly a decade. I know that there's always a threat against me as long as I'm standing up for this. The alternative would have been the site keeps going. And not only me, but the countless other victims of this site who get harassed relentlessly every single day would have to continue through that nightmare.
So again, that's Clara Sorrenti speaking to CNN. Describe what Clara had to do when she was doxxed because of Kiwi Farms.
Sure. So when Clara was initially doxxed, she was also swatted. And so swatting is a tactic that online harassers like Kiwi Farms have used to put individuals in danger. And what that looks like is they will figure out, this is where this person lives and this is their local municipality. So they'll find the local police authorities and they will put in a false report. That can be something like them calling the police department, or in Clara's case, they emailed the police department impersonating her, claiming that they were going to stage a sort of terroristic threat. And so this leads the local authorities, many of whom do not understand what swatting is. They may not have even heard of it as a phenomenon. They will believe that the person, in this case, Clara, poses a threat, and so will send a highly armed group of law enforcement to their house to confront them. And so this is an extremely dangerous situation. People have died during swattings before because, the police think that they are encountering an armed threat. And so that confrontation can take a lot of different forms. In Clara's case, her laptop and some of her personal items were confiscated during a brief investigation. Ultimately, she to explain to the local authorities what had happened, and they sort of apologized and said, now we're going to investigate the source of this false report. But in a lot of cases, it can be too late. And so in Clara's case, even though she was able to escape that imminent threat, she, as described in that audio, she went to a local hotel. The hotel was determined, they found the location. They hacked into her Uber account and sent her groceries. They bought groceries from her account and sent them to the hotel. And so then she actually left Canada, her home country, and went to the UK. And was privately, she did not disclose this to the internet, but she was privately staying at a location in Ireland. And again, they were able to determine where she was, and someone actually showed up outside of the place she was staying and posted a picture online that showed them holding up a written threat outside of this location. So it just goes to show the extent and the lengths to which people will take to continue these harassment campaigns.
Tell us more about Clara. Again, Clara is a trans activist. What made Kiwi Farm users target Clara? Because she had a pretty big following, with Twitch streamers, which is a site that gamers use. Can you describe that more, Kat?
For sure. So Clara is somebody who I think, like a lot of average Twitch users, didn't set out to have a huge platform. Rather, she was just an average person who enjoyed playing video games and using the platform Twitch. But because she's transgender, she started to speak up during her streams about some of the political issues facing transgender people, especially in the United States, where recent legislation has been put in place to attempt to stop kids from, exploring their gender identity or taking steps to medically transition. So Clara began to speak out about these issues, and that was a very engaging sort of material for other young transgender people or just other young people who were engaged in these topics. And so her platform on Twitch grew very quickly, and her style of combating this type of content that was discriminatory towards trans people was she really met it head on. So she engaged in a lot of debate style tactics. She would directly address some of the biggest influencers spreading transphobic rhetoric. And because of her extremely abrupt style, where she would sort of meet these things head on, it attracted a lot of positive attention, but it also attracted a lot of negative attention. And I think that that's something that Clara has always exemplified throughout her online career, is she doesn't back down. She doesn't shy away. In a lot of cases with Kiwi Farms, when people first start getting noticed by the site and the site starts compiling information about them and harassing them, I think people's initial idea of what to do is to just stay silent about it. Don't attract more attention, saying, hey, this is a problem I'm experiencing. A lot of people think that that will make the problem worse. And in Clara's case, she was extremely transparent with her audience about what was happening every step of the way. This may have led to escalation from Kiwi Farms members, but it also led to Clara gaining more and more public support and more media coverage.
You're hearing Kat Tenbarge here where we live, a tech and culture reporter at NBC News. So given Clara's strength to meet this head on, despite, again, this insidious nature of posting about all of her personal information, following her when she felt she had to flee her home country, she was able to get Kiwi Farms shut down. So what's the status today?
So Kiwi Farms has returned to some capacity, but it's not the same as it was before. Essentially, the way that Kiwi Farms was operating, in the way that you could literally just Google it and any average internet user could access Kiwi Farms, they were able to do that because of a service called Cloudflare. Cloudflare does provide hosting services for websites, but they weren't hosting Kiwi Farms. What they were doing was they were providing a form of web protection services to the website. And so Clara's campaign was to get Cloudflare to drop those services, which would then enable Kiwi Farms to be left vulnerable to cyber attacks that could shut the website down. And so it's really a technically interesting sort of debate, because you have activists wanting to sort of fight fire with fire and attack the website. At this stage, the website is it's self-reliant, so it's hosting itself and it's protecting itself using services that are in other countries. I think last I heard they were using some Russian services, but the site has diminished in its ability to reach people. And I would say the site is not as active, perhaps, as it once was.
You mentioned Cloudflare. I understand that when they were first asked to shut Kiwi Farms down or to drop services, they pushed back. And the statement was, in part, quote, just as a telephone company doesn't terminate your line if you say awful, racist, bigoted things, we've concluded in consultation with politicians, policymakers, and experts that turning off security services because we think what you publish is despicable is the wrong policy. Again, Cloudflare did indeed do that later. But, what was your reaction to that statement? Is this a typical reaction by companies, even big tech, related to what should and should not be allowed?
I would say this is definitely a typical sort of sentiment that we see expressed by big tech platforms. In general, there's been a sort of trend of big tech not wanting to take responsibility for the extremely harmful content that is sometimes enabled by their platforms or services. And this is something that we've been seeing over and over and over again over the past decade, particularly as social media has grown to incorporate huge parts of the population. We've also seen the spread and proliferation of extremely harmful content that enables real-life harassment, content that pushes bigotry and division, content that includes defamatory or fake news. And when these sort of platforms and services are confronted with the fact that they are enabling this kind of content, they don't want to be the ones who are held liable or responsible in any way. So what Cloudflare said in that statement, it came off to a lot of people as hypocritical because in the past, Cloudflare has dropped services to websites because of the sort of vile content that was being hosted on them. But in this case, they wanted to draw a line in the sand. And what's really interesting is just a couple of days later, they reversed course and they did drop Kiwi Farms from their services.
Kat, you're a journalist. You're covering this fringe platform. Again, it causes a lot of harm to others. Were you ever worried they'd do this to you? Have you been targeted?
I definitely was aware that could be a possibility. Some of my colleagues and peers have had Kiwi Farms pages created about them. So it was absolutely something that I knew could happen. And while I don't believe there's ever been a page created for me personally, I've definitely been mentioned on the site and in conversations. But for me, I think, and for a lot of journalists who cover these types of things, we just recognize it as part of the job. Really, it's unfortunate, and I think that there's a lot more that newsrooms and people in the media industry could be doing to support journalists and help them combat these things. But once you start covering these fringe online spaces or even mainstream spaces, you will often find yourself being targeted by the exact same forces and people.
You can join us as we talk about online harassment with my guest. Again, Kat Tenbarge is here from NBC News, a tech and culture reporter. Our number, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter @Where We Live. Nina is still with us, Nina Jankowicz. I wonder if you could respond to what we've heard from Kat. And again, there is this belief out there that this kind of harassment is protected by free speech. How do you respond, Nina?
So the comparison that I often make is that if this harassment were happening on the street, you would be able to get a restraining order. I've had, people send me multiple messages like this. And there are ways to try to bring people up on cyber harassment charges. Unfortunately, our defamation law doesn't do very much for victims of targeted harassment and disinformation online. But the long and short of it is, if these people were surrounding you in a mob on the street, you would be able to call the police. And unfortunately, our legal system has not really caught up with the realities of the internet today. And often local police departments either don't know how to deal with these cases, or it's outside of their jurisdiction because it's across state lines. And again, the onus then becomes on the target of the harassment rather than on, the law enforcement agencies that are meant to be protecting us, on the social media platforms that have a duty of care toward their users. It absolutely is not just a disagreement that we're talking about online. It is vile, vicious, sexualized, threatening language. And for me, you don't have the right to, frankly, send death threats to somebody just because you disagree with them politically. You have a right to disagree with me, but that's not what we're talking about here. I'm happy to entertain disagreements online, but these things are not only, covered by the terms of service that the social media platforms have. They're just not enforcing those terms of service. They wouldn't necessarily be covered in real life. And so I think it's time to step up and make sure that, the online and the offline realms of our lives are covered by the same sorts of laws.
Coming up, we're going to talk with you, Nina, and hear from you about how other countries are responding. Before we get to that, though, Kat, I wanted to go back to you because I believe a hacker breached Kiwi Farms and got information on all the users. How did that go?
Yes. So like I mentioned earlier, it's a really interesting sort of technical and ethical discussion happening around Kiwi Farms because you have a lot of independent internet activists who are often operating totally anonymously, who are kind of fighting fire with fire. So a lot of people, would on its face look at something like hacking and releasing, the information of users on a forum as something that is unethical, in some cases even illegal. But in the case of Kiwi Farms, it was really just a tactic that took what they were doing with people on their website and putting it right back against them. So I would say that this is comparable to a case that a lot of people may have heard about with a website called Ashley Madison, which was a dating website for people who were married to cheat on their spouses. And there was a massive data breach where the names of all of the people who used that website were revealed to the public. And so it's kind of a similar sort of unmasking where you have kind of shadowy, anonymous individuals doing this work in order to kind of fight back against. In that case, it was a way for people to cheat. In the case of Kiwi Farms, it's a way for people to harass under the guise of anonymity.
You're hearing Kat Tenbarge here where we live, tech and culture reporter at NBC News. Also with us, Nina Jankowicz, vice president at the Center for Information Resilience, a UK-based nonprofit that focuses on countering misinformation, documenting human rights abuses, and combating online harms. More with them after a short break. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been talking about online harassment today with my guests. Now, our conversation comes 1 week after conspiracy theorist and influencer Alex Jones was ordered to pay nearly $1 billion to families of the 2012 Sandy Hook mass shooting victims. A jury sided with the plaintiffs over Jones's false claims about the tragedy, which led his InfoWars followers and others to harass and send death threats to these families. Now, will this verdict change people's behaviors, especially online? You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Nina Jankowicz, again, Vice President at the Center for Information Resilience. What do you think about this verdict? Will it change people's behaviors?
Of course, I'm pleased to see there is some justice for the Sandy Hook families who have gone through just unimaginable tragedy after tragedy. But I don't think in this case we're really going to see a trickle-down effect in terms of online abuse and harassment, because what has happened is the bar has been set so high, right? Alex Jones did the unimaginable for many, many years, profiting off of these families' personal tragedies, and kind of turning a blind eye to the trickle-down harassment that his commentary, if you can call it that, inspired. And for those people who are undergoing much less diffuse harassment campaigns, ones that are perhaps shorter, there is still going to be an extremely high bar for them to get any justice. And again, that lack of accountability, lack of justice, not just in our legal system, but in the social media platforms that aren't, upholding their duty of care to their users and enacting their terms of service, enforcing their terms of service. There's just no accountability in this space. And while, it might be a kind of detriment to those who are seeking to profit off of this in the future, I haven't seen any real change in behavior. In fact, we see many of the people who are engaging in similar conspiratorial, harassing rhetoric in the conservative social media sphere, mourning the Alex Jones verdict and saying that it is an infraction on freedom of speech, rather than, trying to reevaluate their own behavior. So unfortunately, while I'm pleased for the families and hope that this puts an end to the suffering that they've gone through, I don't think that it is going to send the necessary signal, especially to the downstream harassers who have been inspired by people like Alex Jones.
And, what about other countries? How are they addressing online harassment and the people perpetuating this abuse?
Yeah, so this is a delicate area. And I think one thing that I want to put out there, especially for the people who think, again, that I was meant to be some sort of online censor, I don't necessarily think that removing speech is the way to prevent this sort of harassment. And in countries like in Germany, for instance, there is a law called NetzDG, which requires social media platforms to remove expressly, manifestly illegal content or risk being fined. And what this has led to is actually the over removal of content that is often affecting women and minorities more than it's affecting majority populations, and downstream affecting the freedom of speech of those populations. So those sorts of laws can be a little bit of a cudgel. However, there are some better examples around the world, including in Australia, where they have an e-safety commissioner that oversees the kind of transparency issues related to content moderation online from the platforms, as well as content that is illegal. They've passed a bill in Australia that makes certain types of content like child pornography and non-consensual nude image sharing and online harassment, in fact, and defamation. They've made those illegal, and individuals can potentially be fined up to about $80,000 through the e-safety commissioner for harassment like what I experienced. And I wonder if there were some accountability in the space that we're operating in here in the United States, and most of the platforms are headquartered here, if that would make the internet a more civil place, a place where everyone can express their opinions, not just the loudest and most vicious.
When we think about big tech and the websites that are profiting, I think you've talked about something called malign creativity, ways that people get around how AI that's being used to, I guess, check on what's being posted and maybe to deter or in some ways hide what people are saying. This is what some tech companies have done, but I'm just wondering if you can talk about how people are getting around this and how that pokes into some of these or shows the holes of this kind of enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did some research during the 2020 election when I was a research fellow at the Wilson Center, and we looked at the ways that women who were running for office in the United States, New Zealand, the UK, and Canada were being targeted with gendered disinformation and harassment. And you'd think that, okay, you can just make a list of the insults that people use against women all the time, and that'll bring up everything in that universe. And actually what we found is there was a whole other universe of stuff that the platforms weren't finding because people were deliberately attempting to evade detection through what we call malign creativity. So rather than use the B word, what people would write would be B exclamation point TCH, right? And the AI that's searching for that sort of content would not necessarily be tripped up by that. They would use image-based harassment. So something that men like to use a lot, especially for women in their 30s, and I have gotten this one very frequently, is images of empty egg cartons, which are meant to say your fertility clock is ticking. You should get out of the national security space and go make babies, things like that. Or, these very specific nicknames to describe their targets. So against Kamala Harris, for instance, during the 2020 election, the Biden-Harris campaign was often referred to as pee pads and knee pads, or Joe and the hoe, which was meant to kind of elude that Kamala Harris had slept her way to the top, this disinformation narrative that was quite prominent during the 2020 election. And so what we found and what we're asking for is that the social media platforms be a bit more proactive in their detection of these narratives, right? These are multi-billion-dollar corporations. I had a research team of 6 people. We found hundreds of thousands of instances of abuse and disinformation. And until we rang the alarm bell about it, a lot of it was just allowed to persist, despite actively and explicitly violating the terms of service that the social media platforms had put out there themselves.
We've got another presidential election in 2024. What are your main concerns, Nina, when you see the way these actors are using the internet, again, with disinformation and these harassment campaigns?
I really worry about the downstream effect on young women or even just women of any age making their voices heard online, as well as marginalized communities. It was a beautiful moment to see Kamala Harris inaugurated as vice president of the United States. But if you look on any of her tweets or Facebook posts, if you look at, even her tweets on Inauguration Day and you scroll down, you are very, very likely to see horrific abuse, disinformation, harassment against the vice president of the United States, right? You're likely to see that against probably Kat, against me. Even by being on this show here today, we are likely to generate some unfortunate, unsavory stuff against us. And that is, as Kat said, unfortunately, right now, part of the job. I wish it weren't, but it is. I worry about future generations and other women saying, you know what, I'm not going to make my voice heard. I'm not going to get involved in politics or public life because I don't want to risk having to deal with that. And I think that that is absolutely chilling. It is un-American. And frankly, it is something that we should all be working to change. It is not part of political discourse to receive sexualized threats just because you are a woman who has an opinion who is expressing it. And that is a democratic problem. We can't have a democracy when 50% of the population is worried about the abuse that they might engender if they get involved. So I hope our politicians are waking up. I hope there's going to be more pressure put on the social media platforms, which again are profiting off of this. And I hope my fellow Americans who perhaps, saw me on Fox News or read falsehoods about me recognize that just like for me, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm a fun-loving person. I'm just a person like you. And so are the other people that are getting abused online. We all deserve to live our lives in peace and happiness. And there's nothing that is, American or frankly peaceful or happy about these sorts of abuse that people are willingly and gleefully perpetrating online.
We heard from a listener who asked, if you're being harassed online, you should just stay offline. How do you respond to that?
I hear that one a lot. And my answer would be, if I were to turn off my computer, put down my cell phone, I wouldn't have a way to work. My research is online. I get my voice out there by being active online. And frankly, as I mentioned before, so much of our daily lives, our personal lives, social and administrative, are online as well. And by turning on your computer, if you're risking a mob coming at you, I don't think that is a viable solution to staying offline. That is silencing me. It is silencing the people who have also been experiencing abuse. And I don't think it's fair that people, just because they're slinging insults and threats at me, that they should be able to maintain their voice while I should be pushed into a corner. We all have a right to speak freely in this country. And I think as much as people might claim that abuse is covered by freedom of speech, I would say that the abusers who are trying to silence me, should not be infringing on my own freedom of speech.
That's Nina Jankowicz, Vice President at the Center for Information Resilience, a UK-based nonprofit, also author of the book, How to Be a Woman Online, Surviving Abuse and Harassment and How to Fight Back. Nina, thank you for your time on the show.
My pleasure.
Also with us, Kat Tenbarge, tech and culture reporter at NBC. Kat, thank you for your reporting. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchil. Tess Terrible produced this episode. Our technical producer today is Dylan Reyes. We'll be back tomorrow.